I took the job because my knees gave out. That's the whole story, really. 20 years behind the wheel of a Kenworth hauling refrigerated freight up and down I-80, and somewhere around year 19, my right knee started making a sound like someone crumpling a paper bag every time I climbed into the cab. Orthopedist in Columbus told me the cartilage was basically gone. Said I could keep driving if I wanted to, but that I'd be looking at a replacement in 2 years instead of 5. I thought about it for about a week, then I didn't think about it anymore. I'm not great at transitions. That's me. I found the Iron Mountain listing on one of those job boards, the kind with the bad interface where half the postings are 3 years old. Night security lead. Boyers, Pennsylvania. The pay was decent. The hours were overnight, which I was already wired for, and the description said something about a climate-controlled facility in a converted limestone mine. I figured it'd be quiet, underground, middle of nowhere, government records and old film reels. Who's breaking into that? I drove out in early March. Boyers is a small town, the kind where you pass through it and aren't totally sure you did. The facility itself is set back from Route 68, and you don't really see it until you're on the access road. And even then, what you see is mostly a parking lot and a low concrete building built into the side of a hill. The hill is the mine. The building is just the entrance. Everything real is underneath. Tucker McGuire met me in the parking lot on my first night. He was already standing there when I pulled in, holding a coffee cup, looking at the tree line. He didn't wave. He just waited for me to get out of the car and walk over. He was lean, Tucker. Thinning silver hair combed flat against his head, pale gray eyes that didn't move much when he talked to you. Sharp face. He had the affect of a man who'd been doing paperwork for 30 years and had made peace with it. He shook my hand once, said Felix, like he was confirming something, and turned toward the entrance. "Follow me," he said. That was it. The entrance building smelled like concrete and old coffee. There was a security desk, a row of monitors, a coat rack with one jacket on it. Tucker walked me through the badge system, the sensor panel, the emergency line. He talked the way some people type. No extra words, no pauses that meant anything. I kept up fine. 20 years of dispatch communication does that to you. You learn to pull the information out of the minimum. Then he set his coffee cup down on the desk and reached into the breast pocket of his shirt and pulled out a laminated card. It was about the size of an index card, maybe a little bigger. He held it out. "Rules," he said. "Read them now. Keep the card on you." I took it. The laminate was worn at the corners like it had been handled a lot. The text was typed, not printed, actually typed, like on a typewriter, which I thought was a little odd. 5 items, numbered. I read them standing there at the desk. The first one said that if the humidity sensor for Vault 4 dropped below 20%, I was to flood the entryway floor with water from the mop bucket in the maintenance closet and exit immediately. It said specifically, "Do not increase airflow. Just flood the floor and leave." The second one said no flashlight into the ventilation shafts after 2 a.m. Third one said if I heard a typewriter operating in the records room, I was to knock 3 times on the door and wait for silence before entering. Fourth one said a man in a brown suit might approach me and ask for the 1954 census files. I was not to acknowledge him under any circumstances. Fifth one said if the elevator descended to sub-level 9, I was to stay inside, hold position, and wait for the doors to close and return me to the surface. Because sub-level 9 did not exist, I read the whole thing twice. Then I looked up at Tucker. "The limestone doesn't like being hollowed out," he said. He picked up his coffee cup again. "The rules are what keep it from taking back what's inside." I waited to see if there was more. There wasn't. "Also," he said, "watch the sensors, not the cameras. The cameras lie." I looked over at the monitor row. 8 screens, different angles of tunnel and vault corridor. Everything gray and still and lit by overhead fluorescence. "Lie how?" I said. Tucker looked at me for a second. "They show you what was there," he said. Sensors show you what's there now. He picked up his jacket from the coat rack, told me the emergency line rang directly to his cell, and left. I heard his car start in the parking lot, and then I didn't hear anything except the ventilation system and the low hum of the monitors. I stood at the desk for a minute. I read the card a third time. The thing about 20 years of long haul is that you get comfortable with rules that don't come with explanations. Weight limits, inspection windows, hours of service logs. Half of those exist because of something that went wrong once, and nobody in the chain ever explains the original incident. You just follow the rule, because the rule is there, and the rule is the job. I'd built my whole working life around that, so I put the card in the breast pocket of my jacket, and I started my first patrol. The facility goes down 6 levels below the entrance building. Sub-levels 1 through 6 are accessible by elevator or stairwell. Sub-levels 7 and 8 are elevator only, key card restricted. The tunnels are wide enough for 2 forklifts to pass each other, which they apparently used to do when the place was still actively mined. The limestone walls are pale and slightly damp-looking, even when the humidity readings are normal. The lights are fluorescent tubes in wire cages bolted to the ceiling every 20 feet or so. Some of them flicker, most of them don't. It was cold. Not brutally cold, but the kind of cold that finds you after about an hour and doesn't leave. I'd worn my Carhartt jacket and it was about right. The first night I walked every accessible corridor twice, checked every sensor panel, logged every reading. Nothing was off. The vaults were locked and quiet. The records room on sub-level 3 had its light off and its door shut, and no sound came from inside. The elevator worked fine. I pressed every button. It went where I told it to go. I kept expecting something. Some feeling, some sound. Some moment where the place told me it was different from other places. It didn't. It just sat there, cold and humming, full of other people's things. 9 nights like that. Cold walks, sensor checks, log entries. I started bringing a thermos of coffee. I found a rhythm, the way you do on a long route. You stop thinking about the road and you just drive it. The laminated card stayed in my pocket. I didn't look at it again after that first night. I didn't need to. I'd read it enough times that I knew it. I just hadn't needed it yet. The alarm was a single sustained tone, not a pulse. That surprised me a little. I'd expected something that cycled, something you could wait out. This one just held its note and didn't stop. I checked the readout on the Vault 4 panel, 12%. The threshold on the card was 20, so I was already 4 minutes past when I should have started moving. I didn't run. Running in the tunnels was a bad idea on general principle. The floor was uneven limestone in a few spots, and the overhead clearance dropped without warning near the junction bends. I moved fast, though. Fast enough that my boots were loud, and I could hear the echo coming back at me from about 30 feet ahead. The mop bucket was in the maintenance alcove just past sub-level 2's junction. I'd seen it every night for 9 nights and never thought about it once. Now I grabbed it, filled it from the utility spigot on the wall. The water was cold enough that I felt it through the bucket handle and carried it down the corridor toward Vault 4. The vault door was heavy steel, painted gray, with a humidity sensor mounted at eye level to the right of the frame. The readout on the sensor matched the panel, 12%. The air near the door felt different, drier. Not in a way I could have described to someone, but I noticed it. My lips felt tighter. That's the best I can do. I set the bucket down and tipped it slowly, spreading the water across the entryway floor in front of the door the way the rule said. It pooled fast on the limestone, ran into the low spots, spread maybe 4 feet out from the threshold. I stepped back from it. The rule said flood the floor and exit. That was the whole instruction. No airflow adjustment, no entering the vault, just water, and then leave. I was about to do exactly that. Then the sound started from inside. It was slow, deliberate almost. Dry parchment tearing, but not fast like you'd tear a piece of paper. More like something was pulling it apart an inch at a time, letting it separate. It came from the back of the vault, not the door, which meant whatever was making it was deep inside, past the shelving units, past the file boxes, somewhere in the dark at the far end of a room I couldn't see into. I stood there for probably 4 seconds. Then I locked the door. The deadbolt was manual. A thick steel bar you dropped into a bracket. It seated with a sound like a car door closing. Solid. Final. I left the water on the floor and I walked back up the corridor, and I didn't look behind me. The alarm was still going. I got back to the sensor panel and watched the readout. It had dropped while I was down there. It was at 9% now, then 8. I watched it go to 7 while I stood there with the empty bucket in my hand. The rule said flood the floor and exit, and I'd done that, and it wasn't helping. The secondary monitor, the one mounted below the main panel that showed ventilation system status, was showing an obstruction flag. Main shaft, sub-level 2 junction. The little indicator was amber, which I'd never seen before. The first 9 nights it had been green every time I checked it. I stood there and thought about the humidity still dropping and the obstruction in the shaft, and I did the math wrong. That's the honest version. I was thinking about the vault, about the 12% becoming 7%, about whether the rule had worked or hadn't worked. And I stopped thinking about the card. I stopped thinking about what the second rule said. The access ladder for the main ventilation shaft was maybe 60 feet from where I was standing. A fixed steel ladder bolted to the limestone wall, going up about 12 feet to a hinged access panel. I'd walked past it every night. It was just part of the tunnel. I climbed it. The rungs were cold and slightly damp from the general moisture in the lower levels. My mag light was clipped to my jacket pocket. I unclipped it as I climbed, got it in my right hand, held the ladder with my left. The access panel pushed up and inward. It was heavier than I expected. I got it open and braced it with my forearm and pointed the light into the shaft. The shaft was about 3 feet wide, sheet metal, running horizontally away from me into the dark. The beam only went so far, but it didn't need to go far. It was pale, ribbed, like something segmented. It was pressed against both walls of the shaft and the ceiling, filling most of the space, and it was moving. Not fast. Just this slow, rhythmic pressing and releasing against the metal, like it was breathing, like a pair of lungs that had been dried out and put somewhere they didn't fit. No eyes anywhere on the surface of it that I could see. No features. Just pale and ribbed and pulsing. The light hit it and it stopped moving. 1 full second of nothing. Then the shriek. I don't know what I expected a sound like that to be. I don't think I'd have guessed metal tearing against metal, but that's what it was. Not an animal sound. A structural sound, like a guardrail giving way, like a trailer hitch separating its speed. It came from everywhere at once because the shaft was metal, and the whole shaft became the sound. My left hand let go of the ladder. I don't know if I flinched or if the sound did something to my grip. Either way, my hand came off the rung and my weight shifted, and then I was falling backward off the ladder and I couldn't get my hand back in time. 12 feet isn't that far. It's also not nothing. I hit the limestone floor on my back and right shoulder. The mag light left my hand when I hit, and I heard it skitter away somewhere to my left, hit a wall, go quiet. The access panel swung shut above me with a clang. The shrieking didn't stop. It moved through the walls. I could feel it in the floor through my jacket. The limestone was carrying it, passing it along, and it bounced off the tunnel walls and came back changed, layered on itself, and I lay there on the ground and listened to it and tried to figure out if anything in my body was broken. My shoulder hurt. My lower back hurt. My pride, if that's a thing you can injure, was not doing great. Nothing was broken. I was pretty sure. I'd hit hard enough that I'd know by now if something was wrong. I moved my fingers, moved my feet, rolled to my side. The shrieking was still going up in the shaft, reverberating through the rock. I'd broken the second rule. No flashlight into the ventilation shafts after 2 a.m. It was 2:47. Whatever was in that shaft, I'd woken it up, and it was still in the walls. And I was on the floor of sub-level 2 without a flashlight. And the humidity alarm for Vault 4 was still running somewhere behind me. And the only light I had left was the small, fixed panel lights mounted every 30 feet along the tunnel ceiling. I got up. Slowly, because my back wasn't happy about it, but I got up. The shrieking was moving, not staying in one place. It was traveling through the shaft in the direction of the main junction, toward the center of the facility, and the sound it made against the metal changed pitch as it moved, lower, then higher, then lower again. I didn't have the flashlight. I wasn't going back to look for it in the dark. I knew the tunnel layout well enough to walk it without one. 9 nights. I knew where the clearance dropped and where the floor was uneven and where the junction bends were. I started walking toward the central hub. The shrieking didn't stop. It just got harder to locate. That's the thing about limestone. Sound doesn't travel clean through it. It bounces, splits, comes back at you from a different angle than it left. I'd learned that in the first week when I'd thought I heard something dripping behind me, and it turned out to be a condensation pipe 30 feet ahead. The mountain does something to sound, bends it. So the shrieking I heard as I walked the tunnel toward the central hub could have been right above me in the shaft, or it could have been 2 junctions over. I genuinely couldn't tell. It would drop in pitch, and I'd think it was moving away, and then it would climb again and feel closer than my own heartbeat. I kept walking. The panel lights every 30 feet gave me enough to navigate. Not enough to feel good about anything, but enough. I knew where the floor dipped at the junction bend near the fire suppression cabinet. I knew where the ceiling clearance dropped to about 6 feet before the tunnel widened again. 9 nights of the same route. My feet knew it better than my brain did at that point. My back was complaining. Not loudly, just a low, steady reminder that I'd hit the floor harder than I'd thought. I'd deal with it later. I had Advil in the truck. The shrieking shifted again, lower. Then it faded enough that I could only catch it if I stopped moving and held still. I didn't stop moving. I hit the central hub around 2:55. The hub was just a wider section of tunnel where 3 corridors met, with a mounted facility map behind scratched plexiglass and a small workstation that nobody ever used. The fluorescent above the workstation flickered the way it always did. I'd put in a maintenance request for it on night 3. Nobody had touched it. I had 2 options from the hub: left toward the elevator bank, right toward the secondary stairwell that came out near the loading dock entrance. I wanted the elevator. The stairwell added 5 minutes and came out on the wrong side of the facility from the security desk, and I needed the phone at the security desk to reach Tucker. I went left. The records room was between the hub and the elevator. It always had been. I'd walked past it every single night, and it had always been locked and dark and quiet, and I'd never had a reason to think about it much beyond that. It was on the laminated card, so I'd noted it. 3rd rule. Typewriter means knock 3 times and wait for silence before entering. I'd figured that was one of those rules I'd never actually use, like the flood protocol for Vault 4. The kind of rule that existed because something had happened once, a long time ago, and someone had written it down so it wouldn't happen again. I heard it before I saw the door. The sound was fast. Not hunting and pecking fast. Someone going at full speed, the kind of speed where the keys are almost running together. Old typewriters have a particular sound to them, a mechanical clatter with a little bell at the end of each line. And this one had that. The bell kept ringing. Whoever was in there was filling pages. The door was locked. I could see the deadbolt indicator from where I was standing. Red meant locked. It was red. I stood there for a second. The 3rd rule was clear. Typewriter means knock 3 times, wait for silence, then enter. That was the sequence. I wasn't planning to enter. I just needed to get past the door to reach the elevator, but the rule didn't say anything about what happened if I didn't knock. It just said what to do if I heard the typewriter. I'd heard the typewriter. I knocked 3 times. The typing stopped, not gradually. Not a slow trailing off, it just stopped. Between one keystroke and the next, like someone had lifted their hands off the keys the instant my 3rd knock landed. The bell didn't ring. The carriage didn't return. It stopped clean. I waited. The tunnel was quiet enough that I could hear the ventilation system running through the walls. The distant hum of the facility's climate control. Nothing else. Then a voice came from behind the door. It didn't sound like it was coming through the door, exactly. It sounded more like it was coming from the door. From the wood itself, or from the air right in front of it. I can't explain that better than that. Do you have the 1954 census files? My stomach dropped a little. I knew the 4th rule by heart. I'd read the card probably 40 times across 9 nights. The way you reread something when you're not sure you're remembering it right. The man in the brown suit asking for the 1954 census files is not to be acknowledged. That was it, word for word. Not to be acknowledged. He'd spoken first. I hadn't knocked to answer him. I'd knocked because the 3rd rule told me to, but I'd knocked on his door, and now he'd asked me a question, and I was standing 18 inches away from a locked door with a man behind it who was not supposed to be acknowledged, and the question was still sitting in the air between us. I didn't say anything. I didn't say no. Didn't say wrong room. Didn't say anything at all. I just stood there for a moment, and then I started walking. The door didn't open. Nothing happened. The voice didn't repeat the question. I walked past the records room and kept going, and the tunnel ahead of me was empty and lit, and I focused on the elevator doors at the end of it. But here's the thing that was bothering me, and I couldn't shake it while I walked. The 3rd rule said, knock 3 times and wait for silence before entering. The purpose of that, the way I'd understood it, was that the knocking was a kind of signal. You knock, the typing stops, the room knows you're there, and then you can go in safely. That was how I'd read it. A safety protocol. Knock so whatever's in there doesn't get surprised. What I'd done was knock, and the typing had stopped. And then the man in the brown suit had asked me a question. I hadn't entered the room, but I'd knocked on his door at 2:57 in the morning and announced myself, and now he knew I was in the tunnel. And the 4th rule said, don't acknowledge him, but it didn't say anything about whether the 3rd rule could accidentally do that for me. I didn't know if I'd made a mistake. I genuinely couldn't tell. Maybe the knocking was neutral. Maybe it didn't count as acknowledgement because I hadn't answered. Maybe the rules operated independently and following one couldn't contaminate another. Or maybe I just knocked on his door and introduced myself, and he was already moving. The elevator bank was ahead. 2 sets of doors, both closed. The call button glowed a dull amber between them. I pressed it and the amber went white. The facility hummed around me. The ventilation system. The climate control. Somewhere far back in the tunnels, very faint, the shrieking had started again. Low and distant and directionally useless. I stood in front of the elevator doors and watched the indicator above the left set. It was sitting on sublevel 1, moving down to 2. I'd called it from 2, so it was coming to me. That was fine. That was normal. I kept my eyes on the indicator and my back to the records room, and I waited for the doors to open. The doors opened. I stepped in, turned around, pressed the button for the surface. The one at the top of the panel. Big white S with a circle around it. I'd pressed it 9 times before on 9 different nights, and it had always taken me straight up without any drama. The doors closed. The car moved. Down. I felt it in my stomach first, that drop elevator feeling, and I thought there was a mechanical delay. Maybe the car needed to go down before it went up. Some quirk of the system I hadn't hit before. Tucker hadn't mentioned anything like that. But Tucker also hadn't mentioned a lot of things, so I gave it a few seconds. The indicator above the doors counted past sub-level 3. 4. I pressed the surface button again. Nothing changed. I pressed it 3 more times. Still nothing. I tried sub-level 1, 2, 3. None of them lit up. The only button with any light behind it was the one I'd already pressed, glowing a steady white like it was doing exactly what it was supposed to do. 5. I put my back against the rear wall of the elevator and watched the indicator. The car smelled like metal and cold concrete, same as always. The fluorescent strip above me buzzed at a frequency I'd stopped noticing after the first night. Nothing about the inside of the elevator had changed. It was just going the wrong direction. 6, 7. I started doing the math. Sub-level 8 was the lowest level on the panel. I'd never been below 4. The facility maps I'd seen during orientation showed 8 as the lowest active level, mostly climate-controlled archive storage. Nothing I was responsible for on my rotation. Below 8 wasn't on any map I'd seen. Below 8 was where the indicator was heading. 8. The car slowed, stopped. The number on the indicator changed to 9, solid red, not the amber or white the other numbers used. Just red. The 9 sat there, and the car sat there, and nothing happened for about 3 seconds. Then the doors opened. I don't know what I expected. I think I expected darkness, or another tunnel that looked like the ones I'd been walking all night. Limestone walls, conduit runs, the occasional mounted sensor box. What I got was not that. The tunnel on the other side of those doors had walls made of paper, not wallpapered, not lined with shelves. The walls were built out of documents, thousands of them, maybe more, compressed and stacked so densely they'd fused into something that looked almost structural. Yellowed pages pressed flat against each other, edges blurred together, the occasional stamp or typeface visible if you looked close enough, floor to ceiling, both sides. The tunnel went back maybe 40 feet before it curved, and I couldn't see past the curve. The smell hit me when the doors opened. Old ink and dry paper, the kind of smell that's in the back of used bookstores, but concentrated. A lot of it. The air was warmer than the rest of the facility, which didn't make sense given everything down here was supposed to be climate-controlled. I was still holding the door close button. I'd grabbed it the second the car stopped. The man in the brown suit was standing in the middle of the tunnel. He was maybe 20 feet back from the elevator doors. Brown wool suit, white shirt, dark tie, fountain pen in one hand. He was standing completely still. And then he wasn't. Because he was closer, and I hadn't seen him move. His legs weren't doing anything. They weren't walking. They weren't stepping. He was just covering distance without the mechanics of it. I kept holding the button. He asked for the 1954 census files, not out loud. That's the part I keep coming back to when I think about it. His mouth might have moved. I couldn't tell from that distance, but the question didn't come from his direction. It came from inside my own head, behind my eyes, the same way you hear your own name when someone says it in a crowd. It was his voice, or what I understood to be his voice, but it was located inside me rather than out there. I want the 1954 census files. I kept holding the button. He was closer now, 15 feet maybe. The fountain pen was at his side. His posture was completely neutral, not aggressive, not threatening in any way I could point to. He just wanted the files. That was the whole thing for him. I don't think he was aware of me as a person. I think I was just the variable standing between him and what he needed. The button wasn't working. I mean, I was holding it, had been holding it since the doors opened, but the doors weren't closing. The mechanism was engaged. I could feel the slight resistance of it, but the doors were staying open. I didn't know if that was him or the creature or just a malfunction. I pressed the surface button with my other hand. Nothing. Then something pushed between the doors on the left side. A hand, pale, almost white, with a ribbed texture across the back of it. The same ridged surface I'd seen in the ventilation shaft when I'd put my light in there. The fingers were longer than they should have been, and they were pressing the door back, not hard, just steady. the way you'd hold a door open at a grocery store, patient about it. The shrieking didn't start. That surprised me. Whatever was attached to that hand was quiet. I let go of the door close button and stepped back. The hand held its position. The doors were open maybe 8 inches on the left side, and through that gap I could see the corridor outside the elevator, the limestone walls of the regular facility, which meant the creature had ridden down on top of the car or come through the shaft system and was now outside in the tunnel adjacent to the elevator bank. It was between me and the door mechanism. The man in the brown suit was 10 feet back. I want the 1954 census files. Same location. Behind my eyes. I looked at the elevator wall to my right. There was a small glass front cabinet mounted there, red frame, the kind you see in hallways next to fire extinguishers. Behind the glass was a fire axe, short handle, standard municipal issue, the kind of thing that's in every commercial building and nobody ever looks at twice. I'd walked past it 9 times on 9 different nights and registered it as background, part of the furniture. The man in the brown suit was 8 feet back. The pale hand pressed the door open another inch. I stood there for a second and I thought about the 5th rule, which said to stay inside the elevator and wait for the doors to close and return me to the surface. I was inside. I was waiting. The doors weren't closing. The rule had an assumption built into it that the doors would eventually close on their own, and that assumption was currently wrong, and I didn't think waiting longer was going to fix it. The man in the brown suit reached the elevator threshold. He extended his hand toward me, palm up, like he was asking me to hand something over. The fountain pen was still in his other hand. His face was close enough that I should have been able to read his expression. I couldn't. I don't mean he was expressionless. I mean there was nothing there that my brain was processing as a face, even though I knew one was present. I want the 1954 census files. I looked at the axe. The axe was behind glass. A little red hammer hung on a hook next to it, the kind you're supposed to use to break the glass in an emergency. I didn't use the hammer. I used my elbow, and it hurt more than I expected. And the glass came down in one sheet and shattered on the floor. I pulled the axe free. Standard fire axe, red handle, maybe 3 pounds. I'd seen 100 of them in 100 buildings over the years. This one had a thin layer of dust on the blade, which told me nobody had touched it in a while, which I didn't love. The man in the brown suit was at the threshold. His hand was still out, palm up, the fountain pen in his other hand, his face that wasn't a face. I want the 1954 census files. I wasn't going to swing at him. That thought arrived fast and clear, the same way decisions used to arrive on the road when something went wrong at highway speed. You don't think it through. You just know. Swinging at him wasn't the move. Swinging at the creature wasn't the move. I'd already done everything wrong tonight by following the obvious logic. The obvious logic had gotten me here. I turned to the control panel instead. The panel was standard elevator hardware. Brushed aluminum plate, 2 columns of floor buttons, a phone panel, an emergency stop, a door open and door close. Everything lit in the same dull amber except one. Sub-level 9 glowed violet, not a warm purple, not a faded lavender. Violet. A clean, specific, wrong color that had no business being on a piece of elevator hardware installed sometime in the 1980s. I thought about what Tucker had said on my first shift. He'd been drinking coffee, and he'd handed me the laminated card, and he'd said, in that flat way he said everything, that the limestone didn't like being hollowed out, that the rules were what kept the mountain from taking back what was inside. I'd filed that under colorful local management style and moved on. I was revising that assessment now. The violet button was the anchor. I didn't know how I knew that. I just did. The man in the brown suit had come up from sub-level 9. The doors had opened onto sub-level 9. The whole thing had started when the elevator went somewhere it wasn't supposed to go. And the somewhere it went was tied to that button. and the button was glowing a color that nothing else on the panel was glowing. And that meant it was different from everything else on the panel. And different was the thing I needed to break. I swung the axe into the control panel. The blade went in harder than I expected. I'd aimed for the violet button specifically, and I hit about 2 inches below it, which cracked the aluminum plate and sent a chunk of it spinning off the wall. Sparks. The amber buttons flickered. The violet one kept glowing. I pulled the axe back and hit it again, higher this time, and the blade caught the edge of the button housing and the whole panel buckled inward. More sparks. A smell like burning plastic and something underneath that, something older, like wet stone. The violet glow dimmed. The man in the brown suit's hand was still extended. He hadn't moved. He was still asking, the voice still coming from somewhere inside my head rather than from any mouth. Still the same flat request, same words, same tone. I want the 1954 census files. I want the 1954 census files. I hit the panel a third time, dead center on where the violet button had been, and the axe blade punched through the aluminum and into the wiring behind it. The electronics shorted. All of them, all at once. The amber buttons went dark. The overhead light in the elevator cut out. The display above the doors, the one that had shown the red 9, went black. The whole car went dark except for the sparks still jumping from the panel. Little orange flickers that lasted maybe 2 seconds, and then quit. The violet light was gone. I heard the man in the brown suit. Not his voice. A different sound, quieter. It lasted maybe half a second and then it stopped, and then there was nothing. I looked down. I couldn't see much in the dark, but there was enough ambient light coming from the gap in the doors that I could see the floor near the threshold. Brown ink. A wide, irregular smear of it, like someone had knocked over a bottle of fountain pen ink and dragged a hand through it. That was all that was there. No suit, no pen, no hand. Just the ink. I had about 1 second to register that before the elevator dropped. Not far, 6 inches, maybe 8. The kind of drop that goes from your stomach to your throat before your brain has time to name what's happening. The mechanical clamps caught the rails and the car jolted hard, and I hit the back wall with my shoulder and the axe handle cracked against the floor. The whole car groaned. Metal on metal, deep and resonant. The kind of sound that a building makes when something structural is under stress. The doors slammed shut. I heard the creature shriek once. A short, sharp sound like the metal tearing sound from the ventilation shaft, but compressed, cut off. Then nothing. I looked at the doors. In the dark, I could just make out the floor near the threshold. There were 3 pale fingers lying on the elevator floor near the door seam. They weren't moving. They didn't look like they were going to. I set the axe down against the wall. My hands were shaking a little, not a lot. Just enough that I noticed. The elevator sat in the dark for a moment. I don't know how long. Long enough that I started to wonder if the secondary systems were going to engage at all, or if I'd broken enough of the panel that the whole car was just going to sit there at sub-level 9 indefinitely, which would have been a bad outcome. Then I heard a relay click somewhere above me in the shaft, something mechanical engaging that hadn't been engaged before. The car shuddered once. The emergency lighting came on, a single dim strip along the floor, just enough to see the walls and the ruined panel and the ink smear and the fingers. Then the elevator started to move. Up, not down. No stops. It didn't pause at sub-level 8 or any of the numbered levels above it. It just climbed, steady and slow, the cables working in the dark above me. I stood there with my back against the wall and watched the floor indicator above the doors. It was dark. Nothing was displaying. I didn't know how far up I was or how long it would take. I just stood there and waited. The car smelled like burnt wiring and wet stone and ink. I kept my eyes on the doors. The doors opened. I didn't move right away. I stood there for a second with my back against the wall, just making sure. The security desk was right there, exactly where it was supposed to be. The lobby, the concrete floor, the bank of monitors on the desk showing the tunnel feeds, same as always. And through the glass entrance doors, gray-blue morning light coming in low and flat across the floor. I stepped out. The elevator made a sound behind me, something mechanical resetting, and then it was quiet. I didn't look back at it. Tucker was standing at the desk. He had his coffee cup, the plain white one he always had, and he was looking down at the floor of the elevator car. Not at me, at the floor. He stood there a moment, just looking at the fingers. Then he took a slow sip of his coffee. I waited. He didn't ask what happened, didn't ask if I was okay. Didn't ask about the control panel or the ink or the axe, which I was still holding, now that I thought about it. I set it down against the desk. Tucker's eyes moved to it briefly, then back to his coffee. "Repair costs for the panel come out of your final paycheck," he said. That was it. That was the whole thing. I stood there for a second. I think I was waiting for a follow-up. Some kind of question, or at least a look that suggested he wanted one. But his face was the same as it always was, flat, pale, like he was thinking about something else entirely, something mildly inconvenient, like a scheduling conflict or a vendor invoice. The severed fingers on the elevator floor were about as interesting to him as a spilled coffee. I reached up and unclipped my badge from my jacket, set it on the desk. Then I pulled the laminated rules card from my breast pocket. I'd been carrying it every shift since the first night, folded once down the middle so it fit next to my notepad. I set that down too, on top of the badge. Tucker looked at both of them. He didn't say anything. I walked out. The morning air hit me in the face when I pushed through the glass doors, cold and damp. The kind of Pennsylvania October morning that gets into your jacket no matter how heavy it is. I stood there for a second on the concrete outside the entrance, just breathing. The parking lot was mostly empty. My truck was where I'd left it, a gray Silverado with a cracked side mirror I'd been meaning to fix since July. I walked to it, got in, and sat there for a minute with my hands on the wheel. The facility entrance was visible through the windshield. Just a building, just a door, nothing moving inside that I could see. I started the truck and pulled out. Boyer's is a small place. You're through it in about 4 minutes if you hit the lights right. I hit them all right that morning. Route 442 takes you east toward I-78, or you can go west and eventually pick up I-80. I went west. I don't know if I decided that or if it just happened. My hands knew where I was going before I did, probably. 20 years of driving will do that. I thought about what Tucker had said, not the part about the repair costs, though that was irritating in a specific way I couldn't fully process yet. The part that stuck was what he didn't say. No questions, no surprise. No what happened down there, or are you sure you got the doors closed, or anything that would suggest the last several hours were unusual in any way. He'd looked at the fingers on the elevator floor the way you'd look at a receipt you didn't ask for. Mildly inconvenient. Somebody else's problem now. He'd done this before. Not this exact night, maybe, but something like it. Enough times that it didn't register as an event anymore. Just a thing that happened sometimes at the facility. The way a long-haul driver stops noticing the mile markers after a few hundred trips on the same route. They're still there. You just stop seeing them, and he'd have someone new in by the following night. I was sure of that. He'd already have a name, probably. Maybe a number to call. The laminated card was already printed, had been for a while. He'd hand it to someone new and tell them the limestone didn't like being hollowed out, and they'd nod and take the card and figure it was a quirky orientation speech from an odd supervisor. 9 nights of nothing. Then night 10. I got on I-80 heading west around 6:40 in the morning. The sun was coming up behind me, which I didn't mind. I had about half a tank of gas, which was enough to get me to Ohio without stopping. Somewhere around Newcastle, I thought about the man in the brown suit, Leo Cunningham. I'd started thinking of him, though I don't know why that name came to me. It wasn't on the rules card. It wasn't anything Tucker had said. It was just the name that fit a man in a pressed 1950s wool suit holding a fountain pen, waiting in a tunnel for files that were never going to arrive. He was still down there. That part I was sure of. I destroyed the anchor, or whatever that violet button was, and he dissolved. But dissolving and being gone weren't the same thing, not in that place. The rules card had said not to acknowledge him, not to engage, not to destroy him. Just don't acknowledge him. There's a reason for that kind of rule, and the reason isn't that it solves the problem. It's that it keeps the problem from getting worse. I'd gotten the doors closed. That was something. But Leo Cunningham, or whatever he actually was, would reconstitute or reset or do whatever it was he did, and he'd be back in that tunnel in his brown suit with his fountain pen, asking the next person off the elevator about the 1954 census files. Tucker would know that. Tucker would have already factored that in when he was standing there with his coffee deciding how to word the bit about the repair costs. That bugged me a little. Not the filing situation. The Tucker part. The absolute total indifference to all of it. I stopped for gas and a coffee in Sharon, right near the Ohio state line. The gas station had one of those small attached diners that only ever seem to exist near state lines. The kind with laminate countertops and a rotating pie display, and a guy behind the counter who doesn't ask questions. I sat at the counter and drank the coffee and ate a piece of apple pie that was fine, not great. The guy behind the counter had the radio on, some classic rock station. Tom Petty. I sat there for about 20 minutes and didn't think about anything specific. Then I got back in the truck and kept going. Ohio is flat. Not completely, not in the east, but flat enough that you feel it after Pennsylvania's hills. By the time I was through Cleveland and heading toward Indiana, the land had opened up in a way I recognized. Wide sky, shallow horizon, fields that went on until they just stopped. I'd driven this route probably 200 times in 20 years, maybe more. I knew every rest stop, every truck plaza, every stretch of construction that had been going on for 3 years, longer than anyone expected. Nothing old lived under this ground, not in the way I meant. The limestone up in Boyers had been there for 300 million years, give or take, and somewhere in all that time, it had developed opinions about being hollowed out and filled with government documents. The flat middle of the country was different. Glaciers had scraped it clean and left it shallow. Whatever was down there was just dirt and bedrock and the occasional aquifer, normal things. I didn't stop in Indiana. I kept going until I crossed into Illinois and the sun was low and orange in front of me, and I pulled off at a truck stop outside of Joliet and sat in the parking lot for a while with the engine off. I wasn't going back to Pennsylvania. That was the only thing I'd fully decided. The rest of it, where to go, what to do next, whether my knees would hold up for something that required more standing than sitting, all of that was still open. I'd figure it out. I'd figure it out worse. I reclined the seat a little and closed my eyes. The road was still there when I moved my feet. I knew this route by heart.